about Daniel today. So we're going to take a big overview real quick and then find ourselves in the book of Daniel. Because we've been through a lot of history, right? And from one perspective, it seems like we skipped Daniel, right? And we'll kind of talk about why we actually haven't. So, jumping all the way back to 922, what happens in 922?
Exile.
All right? 922 BCE.
That's the fall of.
We are way far back.
Wait.
922 BCE.
Oh,
No, that's Solomon's death. Isn't that Solomon's death?
Or is it the
We're close, yeah. What happens when Solomon dies? What ends up happening?
split of the kingdom?
Yeah. Good. So the kingdom splits. Good. We go 200 years down the road. 722.
The North falls to Assyria.
Good. North falls to the Assyrians. What's the next date we have?
586.
You guys are awesome. 586. Wow.
The South falls. Judah falls to Babylon.
Good. South falls to Babylon. What kind of happens next in our... What was the next thing we saw?
Exile and diaspora.
So that's this whole period. Right, so they go into exile.
Right. See Ezekiel, the prophets.
Well, we had a prophets even from...
No, but that's not my prophet. My
Oh,
prophet.
your prophets here, okay. Alright, so they're in exile and diaspora until we hit 539. And who comes along in 539? That
Oh, the great.
changes this. Good.
Oh,
Cyrus the Great. Remember, he's with the Persians. Right, this is the Persian period. Right, Cyrus the Great in 539 allows the return. Okay, and that return happens, the next year, 538. Okay, this is the whole history that we've kind of been mapping out with the Hebrew Bible, right? Before 522, we get back into that kind of pneumo history, that kind of mythic kind of history where it's a little harder to say like we actually have some kind of historical account. And even we even looked at how some of the history about David and Solomon may have been shaped in a very particular way to tell a particular story. So we left off here with the Persians. We're in 538, 539. Okay. And what was the state of Jerusalem during this time?
Where?
In Judah.
589.
Yeah, 589, 538.
They having conflict about the return.
Yeah, there's that internal conflict, right? But we've got some kind of, semi-autonomous Jewish state, right? They're kind of autonomous because they've got, the governor and their priest, but it's really kind of just a puppet government because it's really under the control of the Persians, right? This is kind of the world that we're in. Well, once we get to about the 330s, I think it's 331, there's this new upheaval. There's a new power that comes on the scene, right? We have the Assyrians, we have the Babylonians, we have the Persians. Who do you think's next? If you read in your...
The Greeks.
Yeah, there we go. The Greeks. Right, with who? Who's the big...
Alexander the Great.
Yeah. We got A to G, Alexander the Great, right? Alexander the Great comes in and conquers the Persians in 331. Now, what's interesting though is even though Alexander comes in, conquers the Persians, this initially has very little impact on Judah. Right? Things kind of continue. Okay, somebody else is in charge of our kind of corporate government, but we're still kind of just doing things a little bit on our own. Right? The thing that starts happening in 331, because the Greeks have conquered, is called Hellenization. And all this really means is the influx of Greek culture. Right? So we start having, the upper class starts speaking Greek. This eventually filters down to the lower classes. it's about in the 2nd century that we start seeing Jewish texts written in Greek, right? The Septuagint is written about the 2nd century BCE. So this is what's happening because of the Greeks coming in, is this slow Hellenization. Now think about the kind of conflict you had here with, the exiles returning and that kind of cultural conflict they had with the people who were native. We're also going to have the same kind of cultural conflict here with the Greeks. The Greeks bringing in their own kind of culture and identity, and how that might not jive with the Jews. Now, like I said, things are pretty stable initially until we hit 323. Oops, yes, 323. In 323, Alexander dies. And when he dies, the kingdom gets, his empire gets divided up amongst his generals. Right? He has all these generals that have been waging all these wars for him, and the empire gets divided up amongst them. Right? And the two we want to kind of pay attention to are the Seleucids here in yellow, and the Ptolemaic. Right, these are our two empires that we're going to be kind of paying attention to, because if you notice, Israel, or Judah rather, is smack dab right in the middle of them. The land of Judah hops back and forth between who controls it about 7 times in 10 years.
Wow.
Right. 10, 20 years, it jumps back and forth 7 times as far as who controls it. So this is a lot more tumultuous time, right? And we've seen this kind of already with, the Assyrians coming in, the Egyptians coming in, and this kind of how this land is so hotly contested, right? And it's no different during this time, right? Once Alexander dies, and you have the Ptolemaic Empire and the Seleucid Empire. Now in Daniel, what we're going to see is this empire usually gets referred to as the kingdom from the south, and the Seleucids are from the north. Because you see, if we have, there's a mountain range right here, right? So if you have the Seleucids coming in, they're going to be coming in this way, whereas the Ptolemaic Empire is going to be coming in that way.
Who was the general of the Seleucids?
Of the Seleucids?
Yeah.
Uh,
the ruler.
That was
Well, we have
the name.
Antiochus. What's
Just
that?
like, it's a name of the general, and then it goes to.
Okay, right, there we
It's
go.
the same with Ptolemy. Was
That's
I
right.
know who
That's
Ptolemy
right.
is. I wrote a paper on Alexander.
Right, so Seleucid is the name of the general. So they all, the names of these empires, I think, like Mariana was saying, is named after
It's a
these
Seleucus.
original generals.
Seleucus.
Right. Now Antiochus the third comes into power in the Seleucid Empire, right? And things are still kind of okay under him, but it's really his son, Antiochus the fourth, Epiphanes, where the proverbial feces hits the fan. Because what Antiochus Epiphanes does, and if we want a date for him, right, this isn't until, this is between, I think, 175, yeah, 175 and 164. 164, 163. This is when we have Antiochus the fourth, Epiphanes. Right. This is when we have forced Hellenization. Antiochus Epiphanes comes in and says, no, you will become Greek. Right? He pushes back the Ptolemaic Empire. He claims Judah for the Seleucid Empire. Right. And he has this forced Hellenization. He builds gymnasiums, which, for Greek civilization, that's not just a big gym, right? This is a place of, worship and of, there are events, but it's all incredibly focused around, in a sense, like Greek religious life. There's also a time when Antiochus IV Epiphanes puts up a statue of pretty much the Greek version of Zeus inside the temple in Jerusalem and forces the Jewish people to worship that statue, right? So there's this forced Hellenization. And so obviously Antiochus Epiphanes is despised, right, by the local people. Did you have a question, Bob? Okay, no, sorry. And it's in this setting, right around here, maybe around 160 BCE, that the book of Daniel is written. Now, why does this seem a little odd? That I'm saying the book of Daniel is written in 160 BCE, all the way out here.
Because he's talking about Nebuchadnezzar,
Yeah, who is Nebuchadnezzar?
the Babylonian guy, like way back then.
He said we're like,
Yeah,
Right.
back in the day.
that's-
Back in the day.
The book of Daniel places itself historically right around here. Right? This is the setting of the book of Daniel. But the fact is that Daniel is written here, and the best way I can think of to think about the book of Daniel is Daniel is almost like sci-fi in reverse. Right? Is anybody here a fan of sci-fi? We have a couple. What does sci-fi do? Like, what is it good for? In a sense, because it's more than just like, let's talk about space and aliens.
It's more forward. It's
Yeah, it's
What do you
like-
mean?
the
It's
year
got,
20, they were always talking ahead.
it's got like a progressive view on like where we're gonna end up and stuff. Like,
Yeah.
I think of like Star Trek, and it's like,
Or even the Jetsons.
yeah, but like the other aliens think that we're like barbaric because we used to like kill ourselves or something. That's what I think of. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I think so. What about you, Rohan? Any perspectives on sci-fi?
SmackDown comes on South
On guys,
I watch wrestling.
wrestling.
On
I don't know. Not sure that would count as sci-fi.
It's on South
Well, one thing that sci-fi does, for any of you sci-fi fans, and for those of you who don't, like, so me personally, I love what sci-fi does, I just can't get into it. What science fiction does is it takes problems and issues that we're having now, and it sets them in some kind of future setting
Right, yeah.
in order to deal with
But
them.
they're
So,
like, don't you think that sometimes, like, a lot of times they're resolved, and it kind of, because Star Trek did that.
sometimes.
No, not Star Trek. Yeah, Star Trek did that.
Okay.
Like they did like they were historic for having like, it was like this big huge deal because they had like the first interracial kiss on TV.
Okay.
Captain Kirk like kissed a black woman, which was like huge.
But when the show actually came on and that program was there, that's what we were dealing with here.
That's what I'm saying.
So when
Right.
we're
But
talking
it's, like,
about that
resolved.
future thing.
Right.
we
Well,
like
I don't know if
resolve
I'd say it struggles with them. It represents that struggle. It takes that struggle and says, we're going to take this struggle that we're having now, we're going to tell a fictional story 500 years in the future, and maybe if you can think about it in this new way, that'll help you now.
Okay.
Right? So think of, I don't know if anybody's seen this movie that is now all covered up. Right? Has anybody seen District 9?
Oh, with the alien, with the king.
It's a really good movie. Anyways, I don't like a lot of sci-fi. I love this movie. But one thing that District 9 does is it takes the problem of apartheid in South Africa, and instead of making it a racial thing, it makes it aliens. Right?
Oh, right.
Lethia, if you could. Lethia?
Oh, excuse me.
Sorry, it's okay. So it takes this problem of apartheid, right, where we have these huge racial tensions in South Africa, and it puts it between aliens and humans, right, and tells this whole new narrative, right, that's kind of set a little bit in the future in order to help people kind of like better understand apartheid. It struggles with that issue. This is a really good way of understanding what Daniel does, right? Because think about how similar this period would be to the Babylonian exile, right? What would be similar between the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes and the Babylonian exile,
The force and change of culture and religion.
right? So we have Jewish life in a non-Jewish world. Oops. What else?
They took the most powerful people and took them out,
Mm-hmm.
so that they could come in and kind of set the scene for what they wanted it to be. So when they brought their own women in, that's how they started marrying outside of the, I don't know, making it dirty. All right.
They no longer
No,
follow
No,
the
it's
tradition.
unclean.
Yeah, so I think you guys are all hitting this. There's this, struggle to maintain identity, right? Whether this is an ethnic identity or a religious identity, they're in the, oppressed, minority, possibly we could just say oppressed, but they're definitely not the ones in power, right? So by setting the tale in Babylon, right, in this exile, the author is creating a parallel in order for the people to kind of get a better handle on what's going on there, right? Because Daniel is divided, like we said with that initial question, into two major sections, right? We have the first half is narrative, and the second half is apocalyptic, right? And in the narrative sections, Daniel is always presented as the model Jew. Here is how you are a Jew when you face oppression. Here is how you hold on to tradition when you face oppression, right? So, one of the more famous stories, we obviously have Daniel in the lion's den, where he says, no, you can throw me in amongst lions. And there's ways of drawing parallels amongst, lions, as far as being people or systems that threaten your existence. There's another story where Daniel and, I always get the names, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, right? The Nebuchadnezzar, right, the king of Babylon says, everybody has to worship me. They don't do it. Some people report them, and the king says, look, you have to bow down and worship me, or you'll be thrown into the fire, right? Sounds really similar, right? This forced Hellenization. You have to do this. You have to worship something that is not your God. And Daniel, along with these three, say, well, God will save us, but even if he doesn't, we won't do it, right? Daniel is, and Daniel even follows dietary laws, right? The king says, everybody should, eat this meat, and they don't do it. They're not some of the first vegetarians. Go Daniel. Yeah. So Daniel, in these narratives, represents what it's like to be a Jew who is, in a non-Jewish world, who is struggling to maintain his identity despite these oppressive forces. Right? This is what these narratives show us. Now, when we move into the apocalyptic literature, things get a little more fun in a certain sense, and a little more harder to understand. But I think there's a way of kind of wrapping our heads around what's going on in some of Daniel's apocalyptic visions that is somewhat similar to our more modern world. So, for example, right? What is this a depiction of? Right, so we have World War I. Keep going. What else?
King Kong.
All right, who is that King Kong figure supposed to represent?
Person.
Nebuchadnezzar.
Germany.
No. Yeah.
Germany, right? We have Kultur, which is the German word for culture,
Okay.
right? On that big stick, I guess, right? So this is what genre do we call this?
Propaganda?
Yeah. Right. So here we have another example. I'll go through a couple of these. Right. This is Nazi propaganda, or not Nazi. I'm sorry, German propaganda from World War One.
Oh,
Right. So this is Germany. This is Britain with its little, spidey tendrils in every place it can get to. Right. This is another anti-British piece of propaganda. You see how Britain is here, has its little tendrils in every place, and it's slowly getting, cut off. It's losing those limbs. This is,
Dang.
let's see.
That's awesome.
Germany.
This is Germany against Russia. Yeah. So it says Deutschland's war, Europe's freedom.
No, I can't even see that little blue.
Sorry, yeah, the blue's kind of hard to read. Right, but here we have Russia is this kind of like mythical dragon, right?
He's like slaying it. That's an awesome picture.
Yeah, these are pretty epic. Now we're going to turn the tables, right? We're going to turn the tables. Here's Russian propaganda against Nazi Germany.
What?
It says end of German beasts.
End of the German beast.
Vej německých zvěří.
I'm so glad we have somebody who can translate this. Similarly here, right?
Dude, this is good.
This same kind of
Cool art.
this Russian, or sorry, this German dog here, this hound. Now here Germany's got to flip the table. It's like, okay, you're gonna have to pick us as a dog. We'll pick you as a dog, right? So here you have this Russian soldier kind of strangling this like werewolf type creature.
On the rest
Yeah, and this is
French.
French. Yeah, sorry, this is French. Communism is the enemy of France. Right. This is a nice fun one. Here's what I was thinking of. I just got a little ahead of myself.
Oh my goodness.
Here's Nazi Germany getting slayed by the bayonets of the Allies.
That's good. Wow.
That's the end of the
No way.
Nazistic beast.
And here's a really fun one. So this is Nazi propaganda against the U.S. Now look at like how much is going on here,
That's crazy.
Yeah.
right? Like how much symbolism
Look what the star
is just like wrapped up in
Oh,
this,
Wow.
yes.
Money.
It is a lot.
right?
The
Here,
engagement.
Star
right? This like American debauchery,
Star David is told.
Yeah.
right? This like loincloth
Yeah.
for the Star of
What
David.
is that?
The bombs. They got the
Yeah.
KKK, the
The
Ku Klux
Klan
Klan.
here.
Yeah.
They got the
And
robe.
that hat.
The robe. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Look at like, I mean, kind of
Wow.
pertinent for our day, how we have a noose and handcuffs.
Wow.
What was that thing that they told us in poli-sci, Rohan, about the propaganda that they used? They used like the work camps that we have here,
Mhm.
that we had here.
Oh, for the Japanese?
No, not internment camps, but like, like prison labor
Oh, yeah,
or
yeah.
something, like chain gangs and
Mhm.
stuff. They use that as like a piece of propaganda that like we're using slave labor to build our roads and highways and stuff.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, this is how propaganda works, is that it is so infused, right, with meaning. And now what's the, what is the benefit of showing your enemy as some kind of creature?
It can be killed.
Why?
Because they're not humans, yeah.
Right, so we'll put it,
Dehumanize.
there's the fun word, dehumanize, right? So a lot of this propaganda, a lot of these images that we looked at dehumanize the enemy, right? You show it as this beast, right? What else does it do?
Makes people scared.
Right, yeah.
It's like
Fear.
Fear is a huge part of this, of at least like these images that we've looked at, right? I mean, like, there's none of these cases where you're like, oh, that enemy looks like something that's like, that would be like, it's like, for example, like none of these are, we don't see any cockroaches, but it's like, oh, all we have to do is
Who is
step on
that?
it.
Who is that a picture of?
Churchill.
Winston Churchill.
That's,
Churchill.
I was gonna say, like, that's a really bad Churchill.
It's a good
Right.
cigar.
But so none of, like, even when we have a spider, like, this is a world dominating spider. Right? This is not something that you're just going to be able to like spray with raid and it's going to go away. Right? So we have this element of fear. Good. What else? Kind of swing back to.
Like, just disgusting and like repugnant and stuff.
The Statue of Liberty.
I thought it was interesting that they included the Statue of Liberty because that's like such a symbol of
I'm
freedom
trying
and
to figure out
hope.
what this head.
Well, what that is doing, right? Notice down here at the bottom. So here's Germany.
Okay.
Here's the
That's
U.S.
supposed to be the
This beast has come from the U.S.
Oh, okay, I see.
Makes sense.
It's a LP in a hand. Jazz.
Yeah. There's jazz right. We've got the like
Oh,
Slide-
jitterbug
sliding
dancing
into-
yeah.
in here.
Wow,
And
that
then
makes
That's the
sense.
plane. They got the
Right.
wings of
So
the plane.
notice even in this image, right?
I want that
This
picture.
That's cool.
this creature has emerged from the waters,
Like Godzilla.
right? It's like kind of like Godzilla. It's crossed this ocean, come out of these waters. Now think about like if we have a creature in Jewish literature coming out of water. What does water usually represent?
Creation. What?
Chaos, right?
Oh,
But yeah, you're right there with it. But less creation, like what that chaos that creation came out of, right? So here we have like in Daniel we see beasts emerging from the water, right? So these creatures emerging from that chaos, right? So what we see in Daniel when Daniel talks about the beasts, I mean this is a piece of propaganda, right? In a sense, too, what happens with a lot of propaganda literature is it makes it sometimes so that only if you are kind of a part of the group to whom it is addressed can understand it, right? So what the book of Daniel does is it wraps up a lot of political messages and kind of calls for people to not give up in such a way that only Daniel's audience will understand it, right? Because you don't want to really piss off the people who might see something like this. Daniel's not going to be this blatant with his propaganda, right? Because what Daniel does is he wraps it up in this kind of apocalyptic narrative, right? This kind of apocalyptic prophecy. Now, it's generally agreed that the only parts in Daniel that are truly quote-unquote prophetic is from 1140 until the end, which is, I don't know what verse, how many verses are in 12, but the end of chapter 11 through verse 12. Because everything before that, Daniel seems to have, the author of Daniel seems to have a really good grasp on what has actually happened. Right? Who's won what battles, who's moved where, and this kind of thing. And it's only at about 1140 onward that we start seeing like parts where he's not actually accurate as far as what happened, as far as like, nations coming against nations and which ones fall and this kind of thing. So it's really only 1140 through the end of 12 that we get any kind of true looking forward in Daniel. And think about it in this way: if you were reading a text that ended with, or that like halfway through or something like that had, today's events in it, and then kind of kept going, right? You would read that, keep going, that part afterwards, here's what the author is like hoping for, is desiring for, is saying will happen, right? Whereas everything before, you're like, okay, yeah, we're on that page, we're on that same page, like this has all happened. And how much more, if we have, kind of put this in a timeline here. If this is the whole range, of a prophecy, right? And here's you, right? All this stuff is right. This stuff is gonna, that's gonna give you confidence in that next bit, right? Because you're like, oh yeah, all this stuff has happened, right? So, it kind of, by doing this, Daniel Daniel is a work that is trying to inspire hope because it is coming out of such an awful time in Jewish life. And this is what apocalyptic literature tends to do, is it tends to inspire hope. So, let's see here. Speaking of it, let's kind of go a little bit deeper into apocalyptic literature real quick, just to kind of get, because this is really the first time that we've encountered apocalyptic literature. And it's kind of good to dig into it a little bit. So what did we say really identified apocalyptic literature?
Vivid visions of.
Good. Vivid visions of the future. And what else?
The timeline?
No, there's one more thing.
It's not the timeline?
Not timeline.
The history, is it the Revelation?
A Messiah?
What about the Revelation? It has to be interpreted by a divine messenger.
Oh.
That was really good, yes. I remember now.
By a divine messenger. Right. So we have this angel character in Daniel, right, that is going to interpret what Daniel sees, right? And this is very par for the course as far as apocalyptic literature goes, right? And what we see in this second half of this apocalyptic section of Daniel, what we see in the apocalyptic section of Daniel, which is the second half, is that it takes the conflicts that Daniel experiences in kind of a local way with his conflict with Babylon, and it puts it on a cosmic scale. Right? So the first half we have, Daniel's conflicts, and how does he remain, a good Jew despite this oppression. And in the second half, this is some kind of, this is put on the cosmic scale. Right? Now God is contending with evil forces in the world. Right? And if we are trying to engender hope in the people, what's going to be the outcome of this? Is God going to win or lose?
Win.
Right. And if God is winning on the cosmic scale, then on the local we can have hope. Right? So this is, in the local, and this is the cosmic. Right? So chapter 12 of Daniel is this end day prophecy, end of times prophecy, where God is victorious. Right? And if God is victorious on this cosmic scale, then what is happening on our local will be taken care of. Right? Does that make sense, that connection? And like I said, this needs to be coded in some kind of way, right? You can't just come out and say, oh yeah, Antiochus, God's going to kill you. Right? Because if you say that, right, your head's going to be on the platter. Right? So this is why you kind of have this narrative set in Babylonian times, and why you kind of have this apocalyptic, language about beasts and horns and this kind of thing in the book of Daniel, because you can't just come out straight and say, God's going to destroy Antiochus. Everybody, be hopeful. Because what actually happens historically, probably right before the book of Daniel is written, is a revolution. If you, in your Bibles that you had to buy for this course, you have what's called the Apocrypha, which are a series of books that are generally included in Catholic canons and not in Protestant canons. And one of the books there is Maccabees, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Is there a third? I think it's a third. But that is a recounting of a Jewish revolt during this time, right, against Antiochus Epiphanes. Right. So Daniel's probably written right after that. And if he sees this revolt getting put down, you're not going to want to just say, oh, don't worry, we're going to do it again, right? Because then, the authorities are obviously going to come out for you. Right. So let's take let's just take a quick look here at kind of what some of the things Daniel sees. Right. Kind of get you guys to do some of this work as far as interpreting Daniel. Oops. Oh, this battery might be dead.
Reading that, some of it kind of reminded me of when we were talking about Ezekiel and that thing that dream that he had.
Uh-huh.
That he had the foreheads and the wings. And
Right, right. So yeah, no, it's good to draw those comparisons because I mean, what we have to realize with this kind of literature is just how figurative it is. You know, Daniel is, you know, he may be seeing, you know, the vision maybe of beasts with like the heads of lions and things like this, but it's not, you know, that is symbolic. It is figurative of something, right? So this is his vision of the four beasts, right? Daniel had a dream and visions. Let me see here. Daniel had a dream and visions of his head as he lay in bed. Then he wrote down the dream, right? And he goes through this. Saw four winds of heaven stirring up the great sea. This is this very like primordial.
Is that gonna be like, when it says four winds, that Ruha?
Yes, that's what word's going to be there. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I would guess so. Yeah, stirring up the great sea, right? So winds from every direction, right? And four great beasts came up out of the sea, right? Just like we saw that you know great beast of the U.S. coming across and blowing up all of Germany, right? Same kind of thing. You know, each one different from another. And here we have, and these beasts are just, you know, crazily concocted, right? We've got a lion had eagle's wings. Its wings were plucked off. It was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a human being, and a human mind was given to it. Right? It just goes through these really, really bizarre creatures, probably each one representing a kingdom, right, that is come and gone. Right? It just has this, he said, 4 wings, 4 heads. Yeah. Now here we go. After this, the 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong, it had great iron teeth and was devouring, breaking in pieces, and stamping what was left with its feet. Right, so this is coming through very, very powerful and just destructive. It was different from all the beasts that had preceded it, and it had 10 horns. I was considering the horns, right? What do horns symbolize?
Power.
Power, right? Here probably symbolizing rulers, right? When another horn appeared, a little one coming up among them, to make room for it, 3 of the earlier horns were plucked up by the roots. There were eyes like human eyes in this horn, and a mouth speaking arrogantly. Who is this 11th horn probably referring to?
That last bad guy.
Right, Antiochus Epiphanes. Right. This little horn, right? That is.
What scripture is that in?
This is 7.
Huh?
This is Daniel 7.
Daniel 7?
Mhm. Chapter 7.
Verse
I don't have the verses displayed right now. Right, and here we have Daniel. Actually, let me skip to. Is this where I want to go? Yeah, this is actually fine. As I watched, thrones were set in place, and an ancient one took his throne, his clothing as white as snow. Fire issued and flowed from his presence. 1,000 served him. The court sat in judgment. The books were open. I watched because the noise of the arrogant words that the horn was speaking. And as I watched, the beast was put to death, its body destroyed, and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season at a time. And I watched in the night visions, and he sees someone like a human one. So he sees a mortal coming with the clouds of heaven. And this just died. This one. Him was given dominion, all the peoples. Right? And his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed, right? So here is this kind of messianic figure, right? It is only with Daniel, if I can scoot ahead to Daniel 12, I think. Let's see here. He delivered, right, many of those. Here we go. Many of those, so let me start a little bit further. But at that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book, right? That book that we just heard of in chapter 7. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth, which we can think of, what's going to go off in people's heads? You're reading this? Sheol, right? Shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Daniel is the first book in the Jewish canon where we see any concept of some kind of afterlife and a judgment in the afterlife.
Say it again about the afterlife.
Daniel is the first book where we have this idea of judgment in the afterlife. Right? This idea of people awaking from Sheol. Whoops. I'm going to have to wade this to get it to not do that. There we go. Right? This idea that people are waking from Sheol, and some rising to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Right? Is the first instance in the Hebrew Bible where we see this. And so this idea of of some kind of eternal judgment is we see starting to emerge in about the 160s, right? The 150s, the middle of the 2nd century.
So since the Hebrew Bible is like a big group of sometimes contradicting traditions and everything, I was just curious, like what the modern day consensus that Jews have about afterlife, if there is even a consensus.
That's a good question, and I don't right now to answer that. I'm not 100% sure, and I don't know if there is a consensus. I mean, during Jesus' life, for example, the Pharisees believed in an afterlife and the Sadducees did not.
Never said.
What's that? Right. So even in Jesus' day, some 200, 150 years later, that conversation was still being had. But I'm honestly not sure. Does anybody else know? No? Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry I can't answer that.
Oh, I was just curious.
But at least in the biblical tradition,
There's
right?
Definitely.
There's nothing until Daniel.
Right. So it's just an inkling at the end.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. So, and remember we talked about, we have the Deuteronomistic tradition, the Deuteronomistic history that said, along with Proverbs, that says, justice and, justice gets doled out in this life, right? Then we saw with Job and Ecclesiastes, this skepticism of that balance at all. It says we're not even going to think about that because that's hidden. It's beyond us. Daniel is kind of this third perspective that says, no, it's there. And you can trust that it's there. It's just going to show up at the end, after the timeline, right? Not in the timeline. And you don't have to be skeptical about it because it's there. It is very much there, and it's after the timeline, right? So don't worry, if you die in this struggle, right, you will be raised to everlasting life, right? So we see this kind of evolution of Hebrew thought within the text of the Hebrew Bible.
So is that the answer to that short question that you have on the quiz?
Maybe. I'm saying a yes. Right. Let's see here. Right. Good. So this is the book of Daniel, and this is why, for me, it makes the most sense to think of the Hebrew Bible as a conversation, right? It is a community's conversation about their identity and what they believe, right? Because we see through, emphasis on proper worship, and then there's emphasis on, justice and caring for the poor and the oppressed. There's this, shifting notion about whether or not you can think about some kind of cosmic scales. There's an evolving idea about what happens after you die, right? The Hebrew Bible is not, how do I want to say this, univocal, right? It's not speaking with one voice. There's a lot of voices in the Hebrew Bible, and what's interesting is that these voices haven't been edited out, right? They haven't been ironed out, they haven't been edited out. They've been maintained, right? And I think that's really important to remember. And it may have something to do with the fact that, we talked about when the people returned from exile, and this fear of losing their identity as a people, right? If you are trying to maintain your identity, it might not be the wisest thing to do to erase some of it. You know, it's like we have this identity, you know, as, this priestly tradition and this, what's one for prophetic tradition. And it's not going to be, it might not be the wisest thing to say, well, let's just kind of put this tradition, away and just maintain this one, because then you're jeopardizing it, right? So, yeah. So this is why we end with Daniel, because it kind of, it's this interesting book to look at, being that it's probably one of the last ones written, and kind of, I think, very clearly shows a lot of these developments of Hebrew thought in the Hebrew Bible.